Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Richard Clayton is CEO of Round Pegs, a community of disruptive thinkers helping the business community do great work in a VUCA world. And if you don't know what VUCA is, stay tuned because we'll certainly be going into that. Richard has been helping businesses and people deal with leadership, management, communication, technology, and change for over 20 years through his training, coaching, speaking, and consulting advisory services. His innovative research is highly regarded by world leaders in management and leadership. Richard has a PhD in management and continues to teach at Macquarie Graduate School of Management. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Nick. It's nice to meet you.
Likewise. So I figure we'll start here. I guess we're friends on LinkedIn, as it says.
Yes,
and
we are.
In preparation for today's chat, I was learning a little bit more about you. I love the posts that you put up on LinkedIn. I find them very engaging and refreshing. So I do follow some of your activity. And when I was looking at your bio in particular, you have this opening line which really piqued my interest. And in that opening line, you say, it's not about the why, it's about the how. It stands out to me for a number of reasons. One, because it stands in direct contrast to what has become, for better or worse, one of the most popular TED Talks, then turned into multiple books and lots of other engagements of Simon Sinek and his whole narrative or message of the power of why. So I'm curious, is this cheeky ribbing of Sinek's work, or is this something that's completely separate of him? Just curious why you're landing on the how instead of the why.
It is slightly. I am a bit of a cynic about Sinek. I don't know if that's spelled the right way. But yeah, it is a bit of a cheeky ribbing. I don't think I read his book. People were going into what a great leadership thinker he was, and I read his book, and I've never gone through a book. Start with why, and I've never gone through a book where I've just consistently said assertion, assumption as I was going through it. I mean, yes, I feel it's a bit like attacking Bambi with him, because his ideology of let's have a great workplace, you can't disagree with. But his methodology, I have all kinds of problems with. So the thing that really drove me nuts, I looked at his, one of his examples is the Wright brothers, how they invented flight over Pierpont Langley. And he said that they had the why and Langley didn't. Well, it's just not true. Langley was working sort of for more of a governmental, complex, large organisation and didn't have the opportunity to experiment. So he was working with a bad theory. Somebody else was engineering the plane, and Langley was sort of directing it from a distance. Whereas the Wright brothers were experimental and used iterations. So it's exactly the same as sort of looking at an agile versus an unagile organisation. Nothing to do with why, it was to do with the ability to experiment versus the ability not to experiment. So that sort of drives me. Well, it's about the how. They did it because of the how, not because of the why. They had no greater desire, but they had the opportunity to experiment, and Pierpont Langley didn't.
Why? Do you think that? And I have, first of all, I have to agree with you. He's not a trained scientist, as far as I understand. What I think he is really good at is delivering engaging presentations and talks. And I think he has captivated that audience with this particular message. And so I guess the follow-up question I have is, why now has this whole narrative been so engaging to a wider audience? It seems like people are looking for the purpose and the mission and the vocation of our work and the passion. And I think it was just sort of nice timing. Do you see it as that, as one of the reasons?
I think good timing. I mean, he is a very good speaker. I don't disagree with that at all. He's an excellent speaker. But yeah, timing. I think organisations they've lost the purpose. That there isn't really a reason to be working for most of them. It's the same shit in a different environment in lots of organisations. I think over the
Mm-hmm.
last 10 or 15 years, for numerous reasons, organisational life has become really quite disastrous for most people, and it's a battle to survive. So when you've got someone saying, well, okay, just find the one organization where it drives your why and it gives you your passion and your heart, it's a great message. It's like, well, I can escape this, and I can escape
Mm-hmm.
it by just finding something, rather than we have to redesign organizations to stop us feeling that way, which is a much tougher task than going to find an organization that sort of aligns with your own personal interests and passions. And I think that's a bit of
Mm-hmm.
it's that's a bit of a sort of naive wish. I don't think that those organisations necessarily exist, and I think if they do, you're incredibly lucky if you find one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I have to agree with you on that. And I don't think there's enough people saying that. And I'm not sure why. Maybe it's because they're seen as being a cynic, and it's time to focus on the purpose and the passion. And if you say anything otherwise, you're too operational or you're too tactical. I'm not too sure. At least from the lay observer side of things, I'm sure there's a lot of good strategic thinkers in the C-suite and managers who are agreeing with you about the whole how part. Do you, when you go into client conversations, does that resonate with your clients?
No, what I do at the really granular level, what I do resonates very, very strongly with a small number of organisations.
Mm,
So lots of organisations still look at me as if I have two heads. Because I see a standard thing would be an organisation. You would go in and you talk to some of their senior directors, and you'd start talking about the general state of organisation, so the dirty realities of organisational life around the world. And it's not a pleasant talk, because you're sort of talking about people distrusting each other, becoming ill in the workplace for numerous reasons, getting drowned in the amount of work they have to do, getting distracted by all the technologies, and sort of really struggling to stay afloat. And of course, the automatic response, as you'd be well aware, is defensive. So they're like, oh, but we've solved that, and we've solved this, and I'm not saying it's your organisation. It's all organisations. For you to be one of the maybe 1%, if we're lucky, that has worked through all these systemic challenges, would be amazing. But you hit this defensiveness, and I've yeah, there are some people who just say, yes, thank God you're talking about this, because nobody does. But they're few and
mm.
far between, unfortunately.
Do you think it's the ego of those leaders? I can't help but think, this is maybe just my intuition hypothesis, that it's the ego of the executive or the leader who says, well, if you're telling me I have these problems, you're telling me I have a problem, or it's my fault, and therefore there's some resistance there. You suspect that's the case?
Sometimes, yeah, sometimes. I mean, I think sometimes, yeah, people don't like confronting a reality that they've not really thought about before, and it comes as a bit of a shock. So I'm not necessarily
Mm,
sure whether it's ego, rather than, and this sort of my work and irony, it sort of talks to this. It's when you uncover a reality that's very different from the rhetoric that they've believed in, and you sort of say, look, this is what's really going on, this dirty reality, and below the rhetoric that you talk about. It's very confrontational. And the people that I tend to get good audience with are the people who've read my LinkedIn stuff and have sort of come to me. So it's sort of a pull strategy, and they say, like, I really like your stuff.
mm,
It's very different. Let's see if we can chat, rather than when I'm pulled. If I'm going out to an organisation and saying, "Oh, I think I can help you," that becomes really problematic, because they're not interested in that kind of tough conversation, and they do take it personally, or they get shocked. And I'm not trying to do that. I'm not trying to say it's your fault. It's just the way dominant managerial science has led us, and it's very difficult to escape.
hmm That's a good. I guess it's a good approach, and it's one that I also take with my own business. Is you put yourself out there in your message and differentiate it as much as possible, and be authentic about it. And I think what we share in both of our approaches is it being evidence based and following the scientific method. It's more of an inbound. You put that message out there and clients see it, it resonates with them. It either does or doesn't, let's say, if we can sort of have the binary choice, and then they come to you. It's just so much more of an efficient way to find new clients, and to have those conversations, as opposed to finding someone and trying to convince them of it and they're really resistant.
Yeah,
Would you
yeah,
agree with
absolutely,
that?
absolutely. I mean, I don't think I'm as good at it as many people, but it gets you past the first like 10 steps. If someone comes to you and they say,
Mm-hmm.
look, you don't have to write briefs or anything. You sort of have the initial conversation is very interesting, and it's built and they already trust you. So you've sort of got past a number of steps by doing this stuff. I think I should become better at it. But
Mm-hmm.
it's certainly it's landed me some interesting gigs over the years.
And of those people who express that interest and say, like, come to you,
Mhm.
what would you say is their personality and I use this loosely, their personality type? Are they a trained scientist? Do they just have a bent for scientific thinking? Like, is there some sort of demographic there, or psychographic?
I mean, again, for me, they would be the ironist. It's not a standard character type, but again, it's the person who sees the gap between the rhetoric and reality, or the aspirations and achievements in an organization. It's the person
Hmm.
who looked at data analytics and says, well, they don't actually tell me the things I need to know. It's really interesting technology, but actually it's not talking to me in a way that's meaningful for me and my people. It's the
Hmm.
people who look at strategic thinking and sort of the commonplace managerial training and development, and sort of and say, well, that's not what we need nowadays. So they're
Hmm.
not total cynics who don't appreciate, who sort of just say everything is shit apart from the way they think, but they are they look at organizational life and they see that there's a lot more going on than on the surface, and they're interested in exploring it, and they actually enjoy exploring it. So it's that enjoyment. I want to find out what's going on, and I want to have fun doing when I'm doing it. And I want to have
Hmm.
interesting conversations. So that for me is sort of the ironic type, is the gap between the rhetoric and reality, and let's play around and explore in that gap rather than get frustrated and scared by it.
Hmm. Hmm. That's real, and I do want to come back to that, and I want to spend quite a bit of time on the ironic manager project you have. So, if you will mind it, I want to park it for now, because what I do want to just get out of the way is any discussion, which always seems to inevitably lead to COVID-19 these days.
Mhm.
But we were chatting offline about what I think is a really interesting point. So just to touch on that briefly. Um, I've been, of course, thinking a lot about it just as a scientist, and as somebody who sort of lives their life through data and evidence and tries to make sense and make decisions based on data and evidence. This is a weird one because the data is still coming in and there's conflicting messages about the insights and the evidence that are coming from the data, from, like, leading epidemiologists and leading scientists. I know Nassim Nicholas Taleb has had a lot to say on this notion of risk asymmetry and how evidence-based thinking can actually be doing more harm than good. And the one thing I think about, and I'm sure you've been thinking about this as well, is the one cases with wearing masks.
Mm.
Not only, what was it, 3 weeks ago, I guess, because here in Canada that was the start of our isolation lockdown here. Our health officials were absolutely saying, don't wear face masks if you're not ill, if you don't have it. And now they're singing a completely different tune, of course. So I guess the question I have is, how does the zooming out of that, where does, like, scientific thinking fit into this? Like, if you're just a layperson without a scientific training, and you're trying to make sense of what is this, confusing reality. How do you make decisions? Who do you
Mm.
listen to? What is there sort of a best approach that you think of with this?
So again, I'm not sure if there's a best, not necessarily a best approach. I mean, I think we're moving, in the complexity science realm. We're talking about two specific systems. We're talking about a chaotic system which is act and then learn, versus a complex adaptive system, which is learn and then act. And the question is, how much time do you have to learn before you act when there's this fast-moving virus? So for me, I'm based in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong, other than Taiwan, and I'll talk about the reasons that Taiwan in a bit, but Hong Kong has the lowest sort of trajectory rise of all countries that had sort of suffered COVID. And it's the densest developed city in the world. So a city that's given, it's our average density is the same as Manhattan. So it's extremely dense. So it's sort of a pop, and that sort of temperature and that where you think this kind of stuff is going to spread really, really rapidly, and it hasn't. So we're way below everybody else's trajectory other than Taiwan. So just get Taiwan out the way first. They've done an incredibly good job. But just before this happened, all Chinese mainlanders were banned for flying to Taiwan. So they never actually got any input in the first place. So there's something very special about what happened in Taiwan. But in Hong Kong, we had thousands and thousands of people coming through our airport and coming into the country and blah blah blah, and we haven't had the same infection rates as any other country. And what happened in Hong Kong so we had the first case on the 23rd of April. 23rd of 23rd of January. And as you walked out of the building, the sort of news had come into Hong Kong that the case was, and it's the same day they closed Wuhan. And the news had sort of come out, they closed Wuhan, Hong Kong had its first case. So I was in a meeting, and I came out of the meeting, and everybody was in face masks. Everybody. It was the whole, you went from nobody being in face, or maybe 5% of people, to 95% of people within a 3-hour period. You then also had hand sanitizers appear within a couple of days in every single place that I go to, pretty much shops, residences, where I live. You had temperature checks popping up in all over the place. So I can't go to a residence that isn't my own without getting a temperature check in the area that I live. Hand sanitizers, just going local grocery shopping probably 5 times in an hour. I get alcohol hand sanitized, I get temperature checked. So you're looking at all of this.
Like people come to you.
Well, you have to go into the shop.
Sorry to interrupt. Like people come to you.
You have to be temperature checked to go into the shop. Yeah.
Wow.
So the buildings where I work, I can't go in without temperature check, and I can't go in without sanitizing my hands. So this went on from day one. And you look at our trajectory rate, and you're going, well, hardly anyone's catching it, and most of the new, we're up to about 900 and something now, but a huge number of those were people flying back in from Europe and America. We were all over it until this sort of this reinfection from the rest of the world, and even now that seems to be being brought under control as well. Now, at the same time, we went mandatory work from not mandatory. The government had mandatory work from home on the 28th of January, so 5 days after the first case. The schools were shut on the 3rd of February, so another 4 days after that, 7 days after that, and they've been shut ever since. So, what happened here, you should look at it and say, well, why isn't that happening elsewhere? Because look at the results, the trajectory rate, and by the time it hit America, and by the time it hit Europe, we'd already seen this. And we already knew what Hong Kong had done. So why didn't we look at the evidence in front of us? It wasn't like we've got to see how it spreads. But look at what Hong Kong's done. And this is in a country where we'd just gone through 6 months of social unrest and political protest, when nobody trusted each other. And yet which might have been a trigger, because as soon as they found out China was lying about the severity, because they didn't trust China, that might have even been a behavioural trigger. But all of this evidence was already there, and Singapore has done. So they didn't have the face masks, but other than the face masks, Singapore, which had a very low rate, did very similar things. So that for me is just, well, go and ask them what they did, and see if we can do the same thing and prepare as of early Feb, because you knew it was coming. So I'm quite angry.
It seems so
because
obvious, right?
My family has been put in harm's way because of it. So
yeah, and I think we have every right to, because now we're, aside from the disastrous effects of being too slow, of acting too slow, and not listening and not following the data and listening to the evidence.
Yeah.
Now we're going to have the lasting impacts of probably being in isolation longer as a result
Yeah,
of it as
absolutely.
well. It just boggles my mind that it seems on the surface so simple. It's like, this worked. Here we can point to it and we can show you it's worked and it's working. Follow the same protocols, and it's not. I understand the logistics of it is difficult to sort of scale up and roll out en masse, but it's not like rocket science. It's hand sanitizer, closing schools, and like these very easy sort of mandates and directives, and yet we just didn't see it. And like you said, even though there was weeks ahead of time to prepare. So it's a bit of a mystery, and I too am angered, but I can't say I'm shocked or surprised, just given how the people in power think about these things. And I guess probably the biggest tension, my read of it is that the tension that exists, and perhaps one of the reasons why it's so slow to act, or why they're not adopting the same protocol as Hong Kong or Singapore, is that it means if you act, it's almost like a economic impact and these precautionary measures are negatively correlated. So that seems like if you do one, then if you take the precautionary measures, then your economy is going to take a greater hit.
Yeah, but if we didn't have the reinfections from Europe and America, we would have had hardly any economic hit. We're only closing things down, other than schools, because of this new influx of infections. We've just started working 2.5 weeks ago. We started working from home again, but prior to that, we were all back at work. 2 weeks of sort of 2 weeks of almost full work from home, and then a bit sort of more split teams. But really, we were getting back to work, and now we've had this big influx of people escaping from Europe and the States, and we've had to go back to where we were again. I'm not sure that would have been the case. I think if people had reacted quickly, you might well have shut it down before there was this economic impact.
And I'm now thinking, just as you're explaining, and I'm thinking off the top of my head, it's that my earlier comment was the people in power are the ones making the decisions and the bad decisions, but at the same time they're being instructed by what I think, or what I hope, are a very smart team of scientists, and even those scientists aren't making the best calls. And I think that's what Nassim Taleb is hitting on with this. What is it? The absence of evidence does not suggest the evidence of absence. And I think that's one thing that even the best of scientists often don't. I think they get caught up and they get tripped up in that heuristic. So with all the changes that have happened, and across, really across the globe, there's a lot of talk about the future of work, and now, like, what does the future of work look like? Do you see, once all this fades and all the dust settles and we resort back to sort of the old way of doing things, do you think that's going to be the case? We're just going to go back to how it was before in terms of how we work and in terms of organizational life, or do you see the changes and the shifts that are happening now as more enduring into the future?
It's a very tough question. I mean, there are so many systemic things that have to change for us for organizational life to have to change. So you've talked about Taleb. So Taleb's core argument in sort of is that organizations or institutions become too fragile. Because they don't have slack built into the system. So he talks about his barbell strategies and how much slack you want to build in. So when you've got so Boeing is a perfect example. So you've got a company like Boeing who have done the classic shareholder value piece, where they've stripped down their staff. So they've done a whole bunch of cost cutting by getting rid of all their most experienced staff. So they didn't have enough senior engineers, for example, which cost them. And then they went for a massive share buyback, 60 odd billion. And now they're asking to be bailed out by the government because they've got no cash in hand, they've got no reserves, and it was all about increasing shareholder value. Now, I don't want to blame Boeing, as that's the model. Okay, it's it's strip down, it's buyback to when your market, there's no way to grow in the market. That's the only way you increase shareholder value, and shareholder value is what you're measured on. So until you get rid of that, you have a system that creates the kind of behaviours that do that, because unfortunately we all get corrupted by the targets, and that's what we perform to. So that's where the big discussion has to be. And I know in America, the Business Roundtable talked about, I think it was 183 of the 200 CEOs talked about going to a stakeholder value model rather than a shareholder value model. But will it happen, or was that just an open, or just a piece of rhetoric? I don't know. But I think it has to, because you have to build slack into the system. Because if there was slack in the system, we could have shut down for a few months, and all the businesses would have still had money to pay, and we could bounce back without too many challenges. But there's a lack of slack, and therefore anything outside the risk parameters hammers the organisation.
Yeah, you're right, and obviously we would want that as the work that we do, and the sort of the principles that we uphold in our work and in our research. And yet, like, I'm just so I guess pessimistic in the sense that those structures and those systems are so endemic and so baked in that it almost seems impossible for them to change. And then on the other hand, maybe it takes some massive disruption. Maybe it takes a global pandemic for people to finally realize. But I guess it's time will tell, right?
I mean, I think the challenge is if the public has to bail out the businesses again after 2008 and 12 years later again, where how much is too much? How when does it become a big social movement that says this is not right? It wasn't my fault twice now, and yet it's costing me my living and my livelihood, and I don't have the kind of life that I could have. So for me, there's all kinds of tensions, and I don't want to predict where it's going to go, because I think we've probably got 12 months of rolling lockdown. And there's going to be all kinds of tensions that happen during that could take the world in all kinds of directions. We could be in Great Depression number 2, and that's going to require massive levels of government spending. And we've got lots of right-wing governments in power who won't necessarily want to spend that kind of money. So we've got a big political, a big political turbulence as well. It's a really, really complex systemic issue. That's going to require a lot of deep thought.
And then you brought up a point there, like sort of crisis 2008. My understanding was that there was far more sort of leftist liberal governments in power, which maybe it would have had more of the best interests of certain people at heart, versus now, where you are seeing more of the populist or the nationalist government, the rise of those in the last 5 years. So I wonder if the global response from those different more right-leaning governments is how that's going to differ versus the 10 years ago.
I mean, we've certainly seen in some countries the right-wing government sort of moving into huge public spending because there's no choice. Now, how long they will stick with that is another matter entirely. I mean, I would just hope. I don't want to position myself as right or left, but I would hope that we move away from the extremes. So the right becomes a bit more left, and perhaps the left becomes a bit more right, and we're somewhere in the middle, and we stop shouting at each other the whole time. That's what I would hope would happen, at least.
Yeah. Good. So let's get back to this ironic manager project. Because when I came across it a few months ago when I was on your site. Again, also you do a really good job of just catching people's attention, or at least my attention, and that's one person. So you can take that. So you position it as a form of frustrated enthusiasm, and a few minutes ago you touched on it. Do you mind elaborating a little bit for the listeners what that is all about?
So my PhD was it's the end of 7 years worth of data gathering at Australian Steelworks. So it was a multidisciplinary project. I think at the time was the highest Australian Research Council funded organisational project in history. So multidisciplinary team of PhDs and established academics, full access to the steelworks, years and years and years of data collection. And I was brought in as a PhD at the end to sort of, they had this question. So all of these academics had sort of identified the same people as the most valuable people to talk to, the people that gave them more insight about what was going on in the organization than anybody else. They were much more nuanced. They had much more sort of seemed to have a deep knowledge of stuff that others perhaps didn't. And the sort of the language that kept on everyone was using to describe them was people who had an ironic sensibility. In that they poked fun at the company, at the managers, at the researchers, at themselves constantly. Yet they were also these valuable people that were doing the best work, and that was not just the researchers; that was sort of everybody in the company saying that they're really good workers. They're the people I want to work with, and they had this sort of group of people who really respected them. And my job was to work out what the hell was going on, because it was absent in the literature completely. So within the literature, the sort of the ironic sensibility was literally someone who stood on the sidelines and was sarcastic, and was very, very close to being cynical. That didn't add value. It was just a weak form of resistance. Whereas we'd found they were adding all the value too. So we were trying to work out what the hell was going on. So my job was to theorize it, really. So I ended up writing a theory PhD, which is desperately unfashionable, to explain it. And so the 3 points of the theory were, we've already talked about the ironic perspective. So they had this ability to see the gap between reality and rhetoric, or aspirations and achievements. So they didn't just take reality at face value. They saw more than the face value. And they didn't get stressed by it, so they didn't get anxious by it, and they didn't get confused by it, and they didn't become, sort of no emotionality and no sort of cognitive stresses. They actually found it quite interesting and actually quite funny. Very often absurd, funny, interesting, however you want to frame it. And then they tried to communicate it with each other. So we move away out of the perspective and into the performance. And when you're trying to communicate it with people who don't see it, that becomes really challenging, because you might get your head cut off. So the ironic performance is to say one thing and mean something else. And of course, and if you actually look into sort of the cognitive literature, or the literature on sort of cognitive function and neuroscience, they talk about when ironic statements are made, or when you're deconstructing them, more parts of your brain light up, because you're having to work out the actual meaning from a covert meaning. So there's sort of this idea of sort of hyper intelligence going on within that, both constructing the performance and deconstructing the performance. And of course, once you deconstruct it, you've worked out the gap for yourself. So you can't really punish somebody for revealing it. You protect yourself. You don't lose your head because the other person's seen it for themselves, rather than you've directly told them what's going on. And then the third component is what we would call the ironic personality, which is, okay, now you're sort of in this space where you're seeing this all the time. How the hell do you work out how to live with it for the next 30 years of your career? Because once you're there, you're not getting out of it. It's a sort of a sixth sense of seeing the world. So that was sort of how we theorized it, and so, well, this is what it looks like. And then we go into, and I don't want to go into the granular stuff, but we go into granular different ways that people are behaving and responding to these situations, and how their response takes you into potentially different directions.
I love that. What's the motivation of that ironic performance? Like, in other words, maybe put another way, why not just ditch the irony and sort of be more explicit, be more forthcoming? I guess is there concern with that?
You get shot. So the historic ironists, Socrates executed, Cicero executed, Voltaire sent to exile, Oscar Wilde imprisoned. So you keep the conversation going through this humor and elegance and wit and sophistication, So you try and open up the space where people see it without losing your head. Now, so the work I do in the psychological safety space is to try and create an environment where you don't have to be ironic. So you can be direct, but without the psychological safety there, you can't be direct because it's too risky for you. And if you think of the way the job market is in many countries, if you are then let go for being the troublemaker or the negative one who constantly pokes their head up and says, hang on a second, it can be career defining and career destructive. You can end up really struggling to go, why are you unemployed? You must be a problem person. I don't really want to give you a job. So there's all kinds of tensions that stop the person from being direct. And I think psychological safety literature, and I'm on Amy Edmondson's the person who made it famous in the last few years, thanks to Google. But it's been around since Goffman's work in the 50s. I mean, it's not a new concept. It's just become popular in the last 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, psychologists are great at doing that, eh? Old wine, new bottle, brand it nicely. I get a TED talk, and all of a sudden it's a thing, even though it was a thing for forever. Like say in social psych, my background is cognitive dissonance, again in the 50s, sort of the beginning of social psychology, and then the next 60 years was just a series of social psychologists rebranding cognitive dissonance and calling it a different thing and saying, "Oh, look, I have a theory of my own." But anyways, that's an aside.
Not true. I mean, we actually originally perceived irony as so we looked at ambivalence, and we looked at emotional, cognitive, and relational ambivalence, and irony as a way of coping with it. And when we looked at the cognitive ambivalence, we talked about cognitive dissonance. So we looked at the traditional emotional ambivalence from Freud and the cognitive dissonance from Festinger, and then that moved us into the ironic response. Never published any of that, but it was highly informing of the kind of work we did.
Yeah. I should say I just made a totally sweeping generalization there that anything that was related to cognitive dissonance is absolute rubbish. It is not. I should clarify that. I was more referring to the psychological safety stuff. But back to that ironic personality.
Yeah.
Do you see, like, do those types of people with the ironic personalities hang together in an organization? Do they fare better when they're around one another? Do you have any data
so irony is a socially bonding it socially bonds. Because if you work out the secondary meaning, it bonds you to the person because you're both seeing the secret reality. So they tend to come in clumps, yes. And you can pick them. I mean, I say you can pick them. I can pick them within about 5 minutes of seeing them nowadays. But yeah, you sort of say, I want to work with this person. I want to work with that person. And the manager will say, well, that one's cynical and that one's lazy. And you'll say, well, they're cynical because you've never listened to them. And they're lazy because they know all the workarounds. What would happen if you actually said, right, how have you worked all this out and why are you like this? But yeah, they bond together. It's a very strong bonding mechanism. Yeah.
And for talent trajectory, do you find that they're more or less likely to climb the ranks through the organization? Like, are they destined for leadership positions, or are they shooting themselves in the foot in a way?
Well, generally, so I don't want to mention the company, but one of the companies that sort of these highly talented thinkers or ironic thinkers have been identified, and we sort of looked at that company in about 15 years later, and they'd all risen to a reasonable level, but no higher. So there's a limit that they don't play the politics well enough to get right up to the higher echelons. So this is where it becomes sort of quite interesting in the leadership literature. So I don't know if you've read Torbert's stuff. He talks about ironic leadership as sort of almost the highest level of leadership that you can experience. And he argues you only ever see it in glimpses, so like just little lights and moments of it. And I think that's because there's so few people who show these kind of behaviours that actually ever get promoted to those positions in the first place. Because they, however elegant and sophisticated and witty you are when illustrating this reality, the chances are you'll have your head cut off eventually. And it only takes
Yeah.
one person in the organisation to do that, and that's your career stymied, and you've sort of got to that level, and no further will you go.
Unless you start singing a different tune and change
Yeah.
your
Unless
sort
you
of
become
your
this
tact with
ultra
things.
loyalist kind of person,
Yeah.
or ultra Machiavellian games player. I mean, it depends. You can be the sort of the yes
Mm-hmm.
man loyalist, or the Machiavellian politician, and they're the ways that potentially will get you up the higher echelons. The ironist will get you
Interesting.
go so far, but perhaps not as far as they should go.
Mm-hmm. It does remind me, and of course you must be hitting on this theme of like the sort of the archetypal image of the court jester.
Mm.
He was seen on the surface as the satirist and the fool, like even the fool, like the joke, people laughing at, but underneath he was actually quite intelligent and tactful, but he had to be very, very careful to not overstep, because the king would literally kill him. Do you draw on that sort of Jungian archetype in all of this thinking?
Yeah, so not directly from Young, because we abandoned Young a bit when we abandoned the ambivalent stuff, but
Mm-hmm, yeah.
yeah, certainly if you look at if you look at the way the Romans treated Socrates, they almost within their plays they turned him into a jester character. So Socrates is
Oh,
the
interesting.
prototype ironist, and then within the sort of Roman satires, he became this uh, almost a prototype court jester. Um,
Hmm.
and I think you could do the Jungian stuff, but I started there and looked at that manifestation of it. And most cultures have an equivalent of that Socratic jester character, the clever person who acts the fool.
Hmm.
Yeah, so yeah, absolutely. It's a major, it's a standard interpretation across all cultures of this character type.
Yeah, yeah. And one more question to that. I hope I'm not belaboring it. I actually find it genuinely interesting. The personality, are there scales, or is there a scale, like an assessment or a diagnostic, individual difference
Unfortunately,
measure?
no. I would like. Well, I did as a joke. um, I was looking at
Develop a scale?
no, yeah. Well, I was looking at the literature. So there's a wonderful ethnography called Engineering Culture by someone called Gideon Kunda, who used to be in MIT Sloan,
Mm-hmm.
and he 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 I went back through his research because he has these character types, and the characters that they were sort of anti-ironists, and I did that as a joke, an anti-leadership piece where you sort of looked at behaviours of the anti-leader. So it was a company that
Mm.
had sort of done very well, but then all of these zealot type characters got into leadership positions, and you didn't have any critical thinkers there anymore.
Mm.
And so I did an anti-leader position, and I showed it to a company that's been in the news quite a lot recently. So some of the reasonably senior managers there, and they sort of said, "Holy shit, that's almost our onboarding document." This jokey anti. And they were like, "Oh, you've basically hacked into our servers," and I'm like, "Oh, I
Uh,
didn't expect that response, but that's quite interesting." But then, so I went back into the research and I said, "Okay, well, is there a diagnostic And I ended up with a 12-point questionnaire on how
mm-hmm.
you might identify these people in an organisation, the ironic types. Now, it's not necessarily levels of irony, but it's more there's a number of the different dimensions that you might be picking out within
Mm.
the various the granular stuff. You sort of might go, well, here's someone who does
Mm-hmm.
this, someone who does that. So yeah, I put it together. If you can find me an organisation who will happily pay for an ironic sensibility questionnaire, we'll have a go at we'll have a go at putting it out.
Good. Good. I'll hold you to that. That's excellent. So one final question for you, Richard, if you don't mind. This is the BBB, or the Big Behavioral Brainstorm, which I ask all my guests at the end
Mhm.
of our chats. So of all the problems, which seems to be a lot these days, which one would you say would stand from a psychological or a behavioral type intervention?
So what I think the big challenge for the contemporary workforce is, we have a real problem with how we think good work gets done versus with how it actually gets done. So if you look at the perceptions of what good work looks like, it's being connected to the digital systems all the time. It's sitting down in front of your computer. It's being part of email chains. It's being going to business as usual meetings. So people are sort of spending all of their time in meetings, on emails, doing all of this kind of what Cal Newport calls shallow work. And we need to disrupt that, because that's not what you're being paid for. You're not being paid to write emails. You're not being paid to sit in a meeting for hours on end. You're being paid to do a sort of a core job. And these things are disrupting the core job. So what I actually think good work looks like is not the shallow work. Good work looks like a period of the day where you're not being distracted and you're not being interrupted and you're not having people come and need you, and where you can't sit and focus for a period of time. It looks like going into a room together to collaborate over a complex problem, and to strategize through a question and to structure it and to work out who's going to do what and to ideate it and to leave that room after a long period of time with everybody knowing what they're going to do and why they're going to do it. It looks like having cups of coffee and lunch together, and chatting through, getting to know each other, social bonding, but also having talks about work where you find out different ways of doing things and you can experiment with your own way of doing it and see if someone else understands something a bit better. It looks like having chats about what you're learning and what you need to know. It's reading a book, it's watching a video, it's explaining what you've learned to somebody else so that it sticks. It's even complaining about that you're stuck and you need some help and we're going for a walk around the park. All of these things contribute to good work, but they're all seen as not working. Whereas the stuff that makes us so mad and drives distrust and drives sort of disease and illness in the workplace, this digital distraction and the emails, that's perceived as work. And until we actually fix that, I think we're in not a very good place. So a tiny dent in that area, I think, will lead to a huge performance rise. So that's what I would like to see fixed.
Lovely. Great. Well, thank you, Richard. It is very late where you are right now, and I'm really appreciative of you coming on at that time. So it was a wonderful conversation. Listeners will most definitely get a lot out of this. So thank you again.
Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in the episode can be found on the BS podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting, easy-to-apply, sciencey stuff. Just go to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. And lastly, if you'd like to join me in the mission of spreading the good BS word, remember to rate and review the show on iTunes. Why should you? Because 1, you're a part of a digital-wide social proof exercise. 2, you're helping combat the negativity bias in the form of positive reviews. And 3, it's a little pre-commitment for your habitual podcast listening. A little investment to keep you coming back for more BS. I mean, how much more behavioral can you get? Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.